Welcome to the Cherish and Conquer Podcast, the show dedicated to celebrating female entrepreneurs' strength, resilience, and innovation. Be inspired by stories of women and what they cherish to help them conquer against all odds. Every other week, you will learn from remarkable women on how they navigate challenges, uphold their values, and create sustainable success. And now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Welcome to the Cherish and Conquer Podcast. Today we're going to talk about a very, very interesting backstory and what it's led to, because it actually coincides with our majority founder in some ways. And then we're going to have that discussion with Sara Sabin. Sara, welcome.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for having me today.
Okay, so now I talked a little bit about that backstory, and we'll get into that in a second, because I think your transition to where you are today is something that I think a lot of people can learn from. And also, too, that wealth of understanding in that background is important. And I would like to see how it actually fit into where you are now, because oftentimes we don't pull those two things together. So I'm looking forward to discuss this discussion. And so before we get into that, if you could, please share with the listeners and watchers how you're making a difference in people's lives with the work that you're doing today.
So I work as an executive and team coach to create more conscious and exceptional leaders who drive thriving companies.
Okay, so that is very broad and encompassing. So if you start talking about tactically, if somebody came to you and said, hey, we want help in this particular area, how does that kind of happen?
So the first thing I always want to know is, what do you want to achieve? Because coaching is this sort of nebulous area, coaching and consulting, and leadership training as well. I find that a lot of leaders and companies think they should do it, but they don't necessarily know what they want to achieve. So the first thing I always want to ascertain is, what are your objectives that you would like to get out of doing this, so that it can be focused on the areas that will create the most impact based on where that particular leader or leadership team is at that stage in time. So as you can imagine, if you're talking about leadership skills, it encompasses a broad range of things, and it's always best to zero in on what is the most important thing right now and in the next 3 months and in the next 6 months.
Okay, so, and one of the things that you talk about a lot is people understanding the difference and differentiation between management and leadership. And oftentimes I think that's lost, because people blend those two things together to a point to where it's kind of hard to see what I need to focus in on and the impacts of one another. So if you could go through and explain the difference between managing people and leading people from your perspective.
Absolutely. And you're correct, Jim. The two terms are kind of used interchangeably, but they mean different things. And the best leaders, and I'm going to go into the difference in a minute, the best leaders are people that can manage and lead. So if I was to summarize this in one sentence, managers manage tasks, resources, operations according to their function in order to get stuff done. Leaders manage vision and people. So that's, in a nutshell, summarizes what the major difference is between the two. So if you're a competent manager, you have a list of tasks, you have a list of priorities, you have a team that you will delegate to get all of that done in a timely, efficient, productive way, if you are competent at management. A difference with leadership is that they are the big picture vision, big picture strategy thinkers. So it's all very well having a list of tasks, and people can just get lost in this list of tasks, right? And run around like headless chickens trying to do everything. But when you can zoom out and think, okay, what's the big picture of what we're trying to do? It makes it much easier to prioritize things and get people aligned in the right direction. Because in being that big picture thinker, you also want to communicate that to your team so the team understands the context and don't get completely lost in the detail. So if you're a good leader and a manager, you understand the detail, but you can also zoom out as well. And then there's the people part of leadership, right? So how do you get people to perform to their highest potential? How do you get people to work productively and efficiently? And there are some key skills that as a leader you need to develop that will enable you to get the best out of people. And that's active listening and coaching. Now, that basically means rather than you talking all the time, if you want to enable people to come to their own solutions, you listen and you ask questions first rather than leaping in to save people. So you want to get out of that savior energy and into how can we empower those people? How can we ask the right questions to create the insights into them so that they will draw their own conclusions and their own solutions? And basically, you're helping to create more leaders. And then wrapped in all of that, communication is obviously communication is key. So how you communicate to different groups of people, because you might be working with teams from different countries, different cultures, different backgrounds, different personality types, and understanding how to communicate in a powerful way, regardless of who you're talking to, is a very important leadership quality. So I hope that kind of summarizes for you the difference, as I say it, between the two words, management and leadership.
Well, and I think it's also important to note the difference between, if we're starting to talk about, female leaders and managers, and some of the things that we often find that are characteristic to them versus their male counterparts. And so, at Myrna, we want to focus in on how do I become a more effective, female leader, and what are some of the pitfalls that oftentimes women, come across and fall into. One of the things that, especially my daughter, who's, outspoken, and passionate and opinionated. And when you're young, that could cause a lot of issues, right? But it's when people talk about, the dreaded B word, and in a business context, it's boss, and then sometimes it's the other word, that oftentimes is used when it's directed towards ladies. So how, what are some of the things that you often find that are common characteristics and things that you need to address from, the different gender side? And so that, ladies can, be that entrepreneur that's leading. And here's the thing that's important about leadership. It's not just leading your people. It's leading your customer. It's leading your prospect. It's leading your vendor relationships and partners. I mean, leadership is multifaceted.
Yes. And actually the most important element is leading yourself.
Boom.
Lead yourself first before you lead anyone else. So if I was to talk about female leadership specifically, and some of the things that I've observed that come up again and again, female leaders in general, and I will say this is not reflective of everyone, but if we were to look at groups as a whole, these types of things come up. In general, they have less confidence than men. So what I mean by that is they're more plagued by insecurity. They're less likely to be like, yes, I'm a good leader. And, that's actually very accurately reflected, because when people apply for jobs, if men have, I think it is about 60 or 70% of the qualities on the job description, they're going to apply for it. Women unless they have close to everything on that list of the job description, they're not even going to bother applying at all, which is a great shame because they might be nearly all the way there in terms of what is needed for that particular job. And the other thing that I tend to see in female leaders is they sometimes feel like they have to be someone they're not in order to succeed. So what I mean by that is they have to be more masculine in nature. And, you know, that can come across as what is perceived as aggressiveness over directness, etc. And the sad thing is, perhaps if a man was acting in the same way, they wouldn't be labeled in that way, which is an issue. But I think the greater problem that comes out of that is acting in a way that is inauthentic to you and acting in a way that you believe you have to act in order to succeed is draining, it's demotivating, it's often doesn't get you the best results. Whereas embracing more of those more feminine qualities, and these qualities exist in men and women because we all have masculine and feminine qualities, but embracing more of those feminine qualities such as empathy, such as the strong communication, such as the ability to lead, because women naturally have that ability. It's just that it might look different to the way a man leads. But all that matters at the end of the day is the end result, right? So you lead in a way that feels authentic to you and gets the results as well. And I'm also going to say that each of us as a leader, regardless of gender, needs to understand that a balance of masculine and feminine qualities within us is important. Because in order to succeed as a woman, you also need to be an action taker. You need to be assertive. You need to be able to handle conflict, but you can do it in a way that's empathetic without being aggressive about it, which actually is counterproductive anyway. And I would advise anyone approaching leadership from that perspective that it really doesn't get you very far, especially nowadays with a new generation of people coming through the world of work.
Want more insights from female entrepreneurs? Get complimentary access to Marina's Army for additional tips, tools, and tactics from this episode. Just go to mirina.ai and click Community for access. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Okay, so when I started looking at, you know, your backstory and where you came from and working with high net worth individuals and tax planning and all of that, you talked about doing that for a while and then venturing out on your own and starting your own business. So I think it's important, you know, for us to learn from, you know, what you actually have gone through in your journey. So what inspired you to start your own business, and how does it align with the concept of Cherish and Conquer?
So I have always believed that there are no barriers, right? That if I decide to do something, I can do it. So anyone looking at my career or my choices might think, how did she go from this to this to this to this? But I always saw the threads that connect things together. And I encourage women to think like that, because if you focus on the possibility, then you have a real chance to, well, let's say, conquer the world. Let's go big here. You have a real chance to conquer the world. But to explain a little bit more about my background and how I came to be where I am, as anyone listening will now know, I come from a tax background. I trained as a tax accountant prior to that, I'd done law at university. So I did English and French law. And after I trained as an accountant, went to work for a multifamily office. So essentially looking after a portfolio of high net worth individuals and families. So I was in the family office team. I was managing a team there that looked after the clients that we had. And I was in the corporate world for about 10 years. And then I can only describe it as seeds of unrest started to set in. So I started to feel like this wasn't it. This wasn't how I saw myself living out my life. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I just need to find a new job. I eventually came to the conclusion that moving job wasn't going to cut it, or progressing up the corporate ladder wasn't going to cut it. There was something else. And it was around that time in my life that I was approached by a friend of mine who said, do you want to found a company? This was back in 2014. So I co-founded my first company in 2014, and it was an alternative careers service for doctors who wanted to transition into other careers. So we ran events, we ran networking events, conferences, we did recruitment services as well. And I left the corporate world for good, pretty much, because I've been an entrepreneur ever since at the end of 2015. At the time I left, I think it might be worth talking about this. It's not an easy decision to make to go from corporate world to entrepreneurship. The way that I reconciled it in my mind was through a few ways. I was like, right, this is it. This is the company I'm going to be doing forever. And that's psychologically, I dealt with it that way. I also had a financial cushion, which I think is important to give that sense of safety and security when you're embarking upon entrepreneurship for the first time. So essentially, I was running the company. I was running the team that we had in 2015. Long story short there, my vision and my co-founder's vision completely diverged. And so I left the company to her, retained a small shareholding, and moved on to the next thing. I think just to talk about that, in retrospect, it's very important if you're going to go into any kind of partnership that you really check that you are aligned from a values perspective, from the direction that you want to move in, from how you lead and manage people. I think all of that is really important to clarify, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. And after that, I went on to found a second company, which was a recruitment technology platform, raised some investment, built a MVP, minimum viable product, hired a tech team in India, brought on a small team around me, and off I went on my next adventure. I'm very open about the fact that that was a vanity project for me. So I did it because I was trying to prove a point. Like, I'm a woman, I can succeed in the tech world. Yay me, basically. Again, hindsight being a wonderful thing, I would advise against doing things just because you're trying to prove a point, which I was kind of doing at that stage in time. Long story short there, it was a time where I was chronically stressed, anxious. I nearly burned out twice. My relationships were falling apart around me. I didn't have any time for anything. So it was a very, very difficult period for me. And it culminated with my co-founder that I brought on later coming to me and saying, I've got another investor that's going to put in a lot of money. Aren't you happy? And I can only describe it as a feeling of my heart sank, because I couldn't see myself being there for the next 3 to 5 years to justify taking on that investment. And I decided to walk away. It was very much an intuitive feeling that was the right thing to do. But after I did, I got a load of emails from everyone saying, what are you doing? Everything's going really well. You've got traction, because we had people on the platform. We had users on the platform. We'd had some big companies that had signed on to the platform. But it was just this feeling like it was not where I was meant to be, which takes me up to today. Basically, I said in the 2 months after I walked away from my second company, I'm not going to start any new business for 2 months, because the next thing I do, I want it to come from a place of purpose and passion. To use the word cherish here, that's actually true. Like something that I could really cherish and feel like I was making the impact that I wanted to make in the world. And it was at that time in my life I came across transformational coaching. And it was so life-changing for me, because, you know, I'd never really encountered coaching like that. I'd had a fundraising coach, I'd had like a resume coach and that kind of thing when I wanted to move job. But I had never come across this deep type of coaching. And I said to myself, what if I could do this as a business? So I set out to answer 3 questions in the months that followed. Am I good at doing this? Do I love doing this? Can I make money doing this? And after answering yes to those 3 questions in the months that followed, off I went. And that was, I think, coming up to like 4.5 years ago now. And the type of client that I work with are executives and entrepreneurs. And I really get a lot of the struggles that they go through. I've lived through a lot of those struggles. So what I bring to the table for them is the coaching aspect, but also the consulting aspect as well. So practical things that they can do to develop their skills and to work through the challenges that, you know, are there on a day-to-day basis, and how to stay regulated, emotionally regulated throughout all of that.
Well, thanks for sharing that journey. I mean, there's a whole lot, I think, even for me as a guy, that I can, you know, relate to. That's for darn sure. And for me, as you were talking about that transition period when you walked away from your second company and before you started, you know, what you're doing now, I got to know, how did you actually, I mean, you know, how did that process work? I mean, how did you, because there's literally millions and millions of things that you can possibly do, you know, but how did you go about honing in to the thing that is going to fulfill you? Like, you know, like you said, well, you know, how can I find what I really cherish, and then therefore turn that into something that will allow me to, you know, make an impact?
It's very difficult to boil this down simply, but I'm going to do this as best as I can. It starts with intention. So my intention for that period was to find something that I truly cherished, that truly lit me up, that I was passionate about. I didn't know what it was. I let go of the how, right? So I said, well, I'm not sure how this answer is going to come to me. I surrendered the answer and I came back to, but I know that something will come to me during this time. And then I set about taking action, right? So it's not enough to just make a decision, or make an intention. That's the starting point. Then you take action. So think of it as little micro experiments, right? We learn through doing, trying things out, trying new things, digging down into your lost passion, your lost purpose. And it was only through trying out various things that the penny dropped, so to speak. So I experienced coaching in order to understand, oh, okay, this absolutely intuitively makes sense to me. And it obviously, the passion has to align with the talents and skill set that you have as well. So, for example, if I'd have decided during that time that I loved painting, I would have got nowhere. I'm terrible at painting. I can't even draw stick people. But as it happened, something that I absolutely loved and made sense to me also aligned with my skill sets, talent, and experience. And then, you know, it came down to, even at that point, I experimented, right? I said, okay, I think this is the direction I want to go in. Let me just put my feet in the water and answer these 3 questions. So I described it as a minimum viable product, right? That's what I was kind of doing with my business in the beginning. Once I'd proved concept, I was like, right, let's go here. And I think a lot of people expect the answer to just appear out of nowhere or to appear through thinking. It actually comes through experimenting and trying things out and seeing how they work from this place of curiosity, not from a place of kind of scarcity. So if I had started those 2 months in oh my God, I've got to find the answer by the end of the 2 months, otherwise the world's going to end, I think it would have had a very different result. Which is why I always say it's good to have some kind of security blanket, whatever that looks like to you, whether it's usually at least partly financial, but it could be other things that make you feel safe enough to explore. And then the last element to this was a gut feeling. We need to pay attention to our gut feelings because it gives us a sense of intuitively where we're being led towards. There is neuroscience to support why listening to the gut is an important thing to do. And the question that I like to ask everyone I come across is, tell me an example of a time when you ignored your gut feeling and it went well for you. And I've never met a person that was like, oh yeah, that happened to me. Jim, you might be the first person today. I don't know, but.
Well, you know, it's really interesting that you say that. As you're talking, you know, I'm start playing things in my head in regards to that. And I've also had the opportunity to interview Gleb Sapersky, who wrote a book in regards to bias and how bias can lead us in the wrong direction, and where intuition and gut in an extremely extremely complex and ambiguous type of environment can actually lead you incorrect, because it goes back to what you were talking about in regards to experiential learning. You know, if I haven't actually had that particular scenario, if I haven't had that experience, and I can't quickly go find somebody who has actually had that similar experience, I start drawing conclusions from what's already in my, as I refer to, my well, right? My well of knowledge, my well of information, my well of experiences. And I think that's so, you know, when we start talking about that, and even from our own, you know, maturity process, is we have to experience more to get better perspectives, to get better intuition, to get better gut response and gut feel. And that's part of the problem, is like, well, I don't know what's going to happen in 6 months. I don't, it's the unpredictable nature of it, you know, can make it a challenge. So I would dare to say that when we start talking about trusting your intuition and trusting your gut, does it really go back onto and fall back off and help us to do the self-assessment piece like you were talking about, start with self, and then identifying what our values are. And then that's where the gut resonance or the gut affirmations come from. It's like, okay, well, this aligns with me and who I am and how I like to present myself. And so therefore I do need to trust my gut because all those things align. So it's a little bit beyond emotional and becomes a little bit more tactical and analytical, to where I can now start saying, okay, these are, factors of success versus speculation. So I mean, based on what I kind of ran through, what are some of the things that run into your head in regards to how, you would recommend people going through, again, that decision process or that transition process like you're talking about?
So in terms of the gut feeling, right? If your gut is saying a very strong no, listen to that. And that's why I ask the question I ask in that way. Tell me an example of when you've ignored it and it's gone well. Because I've never met anyone that said, oh, I ignore it all the time and everything works out fabulously. Now, there have been people that have said to me, well, Sarah, I followed my gut and it didn't work out well. Generally, what I find is when you dig down into it, it actually wasn't a gut feeling. It was a fear response or a fear decision. That's sometimes what I find when people are like, well, I followed my gut and it didn't go so well. But in any case, even if your gut was right 90% of the time or 80% of the time, those are pretty good odds. Now, if your gut is saying yes to something, in that you feel excited about it, genuine excitement at the thought of doing it, then you send it up to the brain for processing. You send it through the rational thought machine from this place of, okay, well, I've used the brain in my gut as a filtering mechanism. I'm excited about it. Let's look at, what we can do now to start exploring this. Let's look at if this is feasible. And that's the way that I encourage people to look at how they tune that gut muscle. And it is a muscle, right? The more you use it, the better it gets. And you can start with small things, really. Like, for example, do I feel like going out to dinner tonight? Like, your brain is saying yes because I'd like to eat, I don't know, steak and chips. But your gut is like, no, I feel like I'd like to stay home and have a salad, right? Even those little things are starting to use that muscle to tell you what it is that is most aligned for you.
So the, piece that you were referring to of the fear causing an interruption in the ability to make a more clear decision. How does somebody prevent themselves from having the fear become anxiety, lead to anxiety, and then lead to panic? Because even when you started referring to the security blanket and not having to worry about, the money element of me being able to go through a transition process, and one of the reasons I want that is because I don't want to go into panic mode, right? How do I keep myself in the position to where I don't let fear overrun, my gut and my decisions that I make? So, what do we fear? How do we identify that? How do we, control that effectively? What are some of the things that you find that work for people?
You can't
especially women.
Yeah, you can't control fear, right? So, but a lot of people will deny that it's even there. They'll try and kind of muscle their way through it. Or alternatively, they'll be like, oh my God, stupid me, I'm feeling anxious. I shouldn't be feeling anxious. I shouldn't be feeling panicked. And then they'll go down this spiral because they're adding negative emotion on top of negative emotion and on top of negative emotion. So if you think about an argument, for example, You can ramp an argument up further, or you can diffuse it. The way you diffuse it is literally to park it, walk away from it, come back to it when you're not going to be screaming and shouting and blowing everything up further. Similarly with emotions, if you're trying to get a read on something, you want to understand the emotional state that you are in at that time, right? So if you can identify that you are feeling fearful at that time, you will park that decision or whatever reading you are trying to get for another time. And then you will sit with that emotion. Now, it's not always easy to recognize, that you're feeling what you're feeling, essentially. So emotions are stored in the body, right? If you're feeling a bit off, then there's something going on there, right? And different parts of the body store different emotions. So just to quickly share that, for example, jaw area and shoulders, if they're tense, you're probably feeling angry. If you're feeling restriction in the throat or in the heart, you might be feeling loss, or you might be feeling longing. If you have belly activity, so a lot of people feel like crunching in the belly or like butterflies in the stomach, that is an indication that you are in fear and anxiety. If you're there, park the decision, as I said, and sit with the emotion for a period of time, literally just a few minutes. Breathe into the emotion, like literally deep breathing to regulate your nervous system. And then if anything occurs to you that you have to do out of that breathing, you go do that. So it might be, for example, that you're feeling anxious, and it comes to you that you're feeling anxious because, I don't know, you haven't done something specific or whatever it is. If there's something that comes to you that you need to go do that. If not, just sit with the emotion, breathe into it until it starts to dissipate, right? And you also want to, if it's an active emotion like anger, moving it through walking, you can go punch something, whatever. What you want to make sure, though, is that the time you come to make any decision, you've processed whatever negative emotion it was that you're feeling. So I hope that makes sense in the context of how you recognize fear, what to do with it, and what to do with the decision you have to make in relation to that.
It does. My worry is that I park a lot of those decisions, and now I have several that I need to go back and revisit. And I think for a lot of people, when you start talking about wearing, many hats and having multiple responsibilities, that becomes, part of what can cause the anxiety as well. I keep kicking these decisions down the road, so to speak, and putting them off and putting them off and putting them off. And now I have, an overabundance of decisions that need to be made. And then that is yet a separate anxiety.
That is, that's a separate thing. That's essentially procrastination over decision making, which is that's a separate topic. You either are procrastinating over a decision because it's going to take courage to make that decision, or you genuinely don't want to do whatever it is that you have to make a decision about. I mean, essentially, when I say park a decision, you park it for a short period of time until you've processed the emotion. But remember, the number one habit of successful people is they make decisions, and they make them relatively quickly. So if your goal is to be as successful to your highest potential that you can possibly be, you need to be making decisions very regularly. And you also need to acknowledge and be aware of when you're procrastinating on them. Because I can say this, I have seen people fall down a rabbit hole of overanalysis for years about one decision. And, until you get yourself out of that state and into, okay, I understand what's happening here. I'm scared, because a lot of the time people get into over-analysis because they're scared of actually doing the thing. Until you acknowledge that, move through the fear, move through the worst case scenario, which will enable you to make the decision.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, you have to practice making decisions more, efficiently and effectively, and make more of them.
Exactly. So essentially, successful people, obviously not every decision they make will be correct, but because they make more decisions than the average person, what happens is over the course of time, they will be a lot more successful than the average person, purely because they make decisions and get on with it.
I think that's great advice.
Enjoying the show? After joining Marina's army, subscribe and share the Cherish and Conquer podcast on your favorite platform. Thank you. Now, back to the show.
Okay, Sara, fabulous advice. But now we're actually going to do a rapid fire, and you're going to participate in our breakthrough blitz. You've already given us some great information to help us break through on some of the things that we need to. But are you ready to help us a little bit more with the breakthrough blitz?
I am. Let's go.
All right. So what's your favorite productivity tool or app?
My favorite productivity tool is my calendar, right? So I am very much a scheduler. I block my time. I create free time as well, where it's free thinking space, reflection time. And that's what I use in order to be the most productive that I can be.
What's your favorite way to unwind after a busy day?
My favorite way to unwind is either through exercise, or I like to put on some music and sing really badly. Again, something I'm very passionate about, but also very bad at the same time.
If you could have dinner with any female business leader, living or deceased, who would it be?
First person that came to my head is Sheryl Sandberg, actually.
What's your favorite quote or mantra that keeps you motivated?
The journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to aspiring female entrepreneurs?
Just do it. Get into action.
Okay, this is my last Breakthrough Blitz question. What's the biggest misconception people have about being a female entrepreneur, and how do you address it in your own experience?
That in order to succeed as an entrepreneur, you need to be like everyone else, or you need to be like a man. I think that's a misconception that I often see, and you don't. You get to craft how you do things. You get to decide to work in alignment with your value system, with your energies as a female entrepreneur.
Sara Sabin, how do the listeners and watchers get in touch with you?
So you can contact me via LinkedIn. I am Sara Caroline Sabin, or via my website, which is sarasabin.com.
Sara, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the Cherish and Conquer podcast from Marina. Join our community of trailblazing women at community.marina.ai and get access to exclusive resources, checklists, and guides. If you found value in today's episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it across your social platforms. See you soon, and remember, barriers are for breaking.
Look at me right